In an effort to understand the growth of gangs, American sociologist Walter B. Miller tracked the spread of gang problems across U.S. cities from the 1970s through the early 2000s. During this period, the number of cities reporting gang problems grew more than sevenfold, from just over 200 in 1970 to nearly 1,500 by the beginning of the 20th century. A key element during this time period was the increasing availability of both cars and guns to lethal gangs. Drive-by shootings are a popular tactic used by gangs. A method naturally increased with the wide availability of automobiles and guns, which also changed the way many gangs engaged in fighting, as much of it composed of mostly hand-to-hand combat or hand-to-hand weaponry. Nationwide, every region of the country gained a rampant number and increased gang activity, with the South in particular beginning to see the rise in gangs that were no longer exclusive based on neighborhood youth protecting turf, but rather a new territory for expanded nation gangs, such as the Crips and Bloods, to sell their product of crack cocaine, an epidemic that famously brought motivations to high crime syndicates. Another key element of gangs within their time frame of expansion across these 3 decades is the increase in violence. To illustrate this idea, we can look at the massive cities of Los Angeles and Chicago, which have continuously been home grounds for the rampant growth of gangs. As Chicago and Los Angeles felt their gang increases between the mid-1980s up to the end of the 19th century, these two cities would inevitably make up half of the gang violence homicide rate nationwide in 2001. Los Angeles and Chicago also began to drastically increase their citywide homicide rates due to gangs as well. In Los Angeles, 15% of all homicides in 1984 were gang-related, compared to 45% reported in 1995, a triple increase within the span of a decade. With such a high rate of homicide increasing citywide, and the tactic of drive-by shootings beginning to increase, naturally rose to higher levels of innocent bystanders getting caught up in gang violence, as public settings were being used more often to involve disputes. During 1987 to 1990, Chicago focused heavy analysis on the most criminally active gangs at the time, which were the Black Gangster Disciples Nation, the Latin Disciples, the Latin Kings, and the Vice Lords. The Chicago Police Department estimates that these four gangs alone made up of 69% of all street gang-motivated crimes and for 56% of all street gang-motivated homicides in the city. The highest points of gang violence during this time period are scattered. Well-organized gangs tend to provoke more rivalries, and in turn, attract more challenges themselves. This cycle often fuels sudden surges of gang violence, conflicts that flare up, subside, and at times continue intermittently for years. Similarly, observed in St. Louis, a cycle of violence process begins with a loosely organized gang, with loose bonds to the gang. The collective identification of threat from a rival gang reinforces the centrality of violence that expands the number of participants and increases cohesion. Next, a mobilizing event occurs, possibly but not necessarily violence. This escalates cohesive gang activity, and the group becomes more alert and cohesive. A violent incident against the threatening group occurs, followed by rapid de-escalation. Later, violent retaliation by the opposing gang occurs. Whatever the purpose of violence, it often leads to retaliation and revenge, creating a feedback loop where each killing requires a new killing, a common social phenomenon throughout the world of gangs that have established themselves in such major cities. With this repeating itself continuously, this gives birth to network structure that persists and may very well provide the conduit through which gang values, norms, and culture are transmitted to future generations. California researchers, led by George Tita, mapped the locations of 13 of the 29 active criminal street gangs in the East Los Angeles area, where predominant Mexican-American, otherwise known as Chicano gangs, first formed. In this area, gang violence makes up about 75% of all lethal incidents. Between 2000 and 2002, researchers recorded over 1,000 violent crimes, averaging just over 10 gang-related incidents per census block. A closer look at 563 shootings between 13 rival gangs showed that most violence happens along gang boundaries. Two of the most active gangs, White Fence and Quattro Flats, date back to the 1930s and 1940s, showing just how long some of these groups have been established. Quattro Flats was one of East Los Angeles's classic gangs. Mexican families began migrating to the area in the 1920s, settling in makeshift shacks built from discarded materials. The gang formed in the early 1940s, shortly after the Pico Gardens housing project opened in 1942, claiming 4th Street as its territory. Quattro Flats offered an alternative social structure, with its own norms, rituals, and enforcement mechanisms that functioned as a surrogate family for its members, many of whom grew up in marginalized households. Life in established gangs like Quattro Flats was guided by a clear set of values. Protection was paramount, requiring members to watch each other's backs. Loyalty was demanded, often tied to defending turf. Respect for older members was essential, and emotional support was expected, mirroring familial bonds. From the 1940s onward, Quattro Flats expanded to include 14 cliques, typically recruiting members around 13 or 14 years old and keeping them active until their early 20s. In its early years, the gang focused mostly on hanging out and socializing, but by the 1950s, physical fights, more often rumbles than shootings, became common among Quattro Flats and other gangs in Pico Gardens and the wider Boyle Heights area. Gang violence continued to escalate through the 1950s and 1960s. Although firearms were rarely used during this period, that would change dramatically in the 1980s. A combination of fewer committed young recruits and the lure of drug use and crack cocaine trafficking left the gang increasingly vulnerable. The influx of guns and drugs would ultimately shape its future character. Younger members stopped following the leadership of the OGs, original gangsters, and no longer sought guidance from them. Instead, they began creating their own rules. Meanwhile, many veteran leaders had become largely inactive, whether due to incarceration, death, or struggles with drug addiction. Quattro Flats fractured over the trafficking of PCP and crack cocaine, with members increasingly clashing with other young adults in the barrio, further discouraging potential recruits. As a result, the gang's influence waned, and its internal structure became irreversibly fragmented. Conflicts with adults involved in the drug trade only deepened these divisions. Meanwhile, street gangs expanded, and overall violence surged. By the 1970s and 1980s, Quattro Flats had transformed into a major gang, competing with the most dangerous black gangs in the area. By 2007, the broader Pico Aliso neighborhood was home to 8 major gangs and dozens of disorganized ones, with the Los Angeles Police Department noting gang activity was unmatched anywhere else in the city. Evolving from a barrio-based gang to a multi-neighborhood organization with a formidable capacity for firearm violence. Quattro Flats has remained one of the most violent gangs in the area since the 1980s. In short, Quattro Flats evolved from a classic barrio gang into a modern street gang, focused on competition with rival groups for limited space within a densely populated ghetto. The surge of gang problems in many cities between 1980 and 2000 reflects the rapid institutionalization of gangs and the influence of key socio-historical factors that contributed to their long-term persistence, particularly youth subculture, drug trafficking, access to more lethal weapons, public housing projects, and expanding social networks that perpetuate cycles of violence. Research indicates that the most violent gangs tend to share 3 characteristics: the number of gangs in an area, the size of gang membership, and the degree of organizational structure and coordination. Getting off the data collection period from Walter Miller, let's look at charted gang activity from 1996 to 2012. The first year of data collection in this nationally representative survey of law enforcement, 1996, has stood up as the single year with the most widespread reported gang activity, an apex that also was observed in Miller's data. Except for a sharp drop in prevalence from 1996 to 2001, reported gang activity has remained fairly stable since 2002. The onset of gang problems varied by city size. This figure illustrates the reported year of gang activity onset in the National Youth Gang Survey, organized by population group. In the largest cities, gang activity began to emerge in the mid-1970s. Over the next 25 years, from 1975 to 2000, the proportion of very large cities experiencing gang problems rose more than eightfold, from under 10% to 93%. The steepest increase occurred between the mid-1980s and mid-1990s, when reports of gang activity tripled in just 15 years. Medium-sized cities with populations between 50,000 and 100,000 also saw dramatic growth, rising from 2% to 66% over the same period. On average, the year of gang onset was 1985 for the largest cities, 1988 for Group 2 cities, 1990 for Group 3 cities, and 1992 for small towns and villages with fewer than 25,000 residents. Gangs that emerged in large U.S. cities before 1985 became increasingly permanent over time. Between 2007 and 2011, these cities reported homicide levels 5 times higher than those with populations under 100,000. In general, cities with early gang onset, prior to the 1990s, faced more severe problems, as their gangs were far more likely to be engaged in violent crime and drug trafficking. Gang-related homicides are most commonly reported in large population centers with long-standing entrenched gang activity. Later onset jurisdictions, often rural areas, smaller cities, or suburban counties with fewer than 50,000 residents, reported far less violent involvement. Today, cities with populations exceeding 100,000 host the overwhelming majority of dangerous gangs and gang members in the U.S., particularly older, more violent organizations dominated by young adults. These cities consistently experience high levels of gang-related homicides, intimidation, and pervasive fear, with very large cities housing the largest and most numerous gangs. A number of factors have been linked to the nationwide rise in violent gang activity, with drug trafficking often cited as the leading cause. During the 1980s, as reports of gang violence increased in certain cities, the media and some federal sources began speculating that gangs were migrating across the country to establish profitable drug operations, fueled by the growing demand for crack cocaine. This narrative especially centered on the spread of Los Angeles-based gangs like the Bloods and Crips. While some street gangs have developed into more organized, business-like criminal groups, most do not meet the strict criteria of organized crime. True organized crime groups, such as drug cartels, are marked by strong leadership, strict codes of loyalty, harsh penalties for breaking rules, and the ability to reinvest profits from drug sales. In reality, large-scale drug trafficking is typically controlled by adult cartels or syndicates, while street gangs are more heavily involved in selling drugs at the neighborhood level. Researchers have questioned whether gangs themselves move from city to city and cause new gang problems. A USC study in the early 1990s looked at 60 mid-sized cities and found that gang migration was not the main reason for the big rise in gangs. Instead, most cities that saw gang members move in already had gangs of their own. Other studies support this, showing that gang growth is mostly local, not imported. Street gangs rarely move as entire groups, though drug trafficking groups do this more often. When individual gang members move, it's usually for personal reasons like family or social ties, not to spread the gang. In other words, the majority of why gangs were seeing such a huge increase in their neighborhoods were mostly due to local city street gangs forming, rather than the expansion of a selective few. Walter Miller believes that for those selective groups, most gang member migration occurred in conjunction with the enormous U.S. population shift during the 1980s and 1990s to predominantly suburban areas. Researchers used trajectory modeling to study how violent gang activity has changed over time in major U.S. cities. This method groups cities that show similar long-term patterns, in this case, the share of homicides that were gang-related, and then displays those patterns over a 14-year period. The study focused on 247 of the nation's largest cities, each with populations over 100,000, to track their histories of gang-related violence. This analysis can be summarized with four key points. First, most cities in trajectories 1, 2, and 4 showed relatively stable levels of gang-related homicides over the 14-year period, with only minor fluctuations. Second, nearly two-thirds of the cities reported that between 20% and 40% of all homicides were gang-related from 1996 to 2009. Third, about 6% of cities, those in trajectories 3 and 5, experienced sharp increases in gang homicide rates during this time. Finally, the cities with the highest rates, trajectories 2, 3, and 5, were concentrated in 5 regions: the Los Angeles Basin, California's Bay Area, the Great Lakes, the Northeast, and Florida's Atlantic coast from Miami northward. Overall, it is clear that very large cities with persistently high levels of gang homicide are spread across multiple parts of the United States. Hopefully, this video provided you with a pretty good insight into the rapid gang epidemic era of America, with much of the reasons why this era started, as well as what has come as a result of it, that has shaped the current gang world today. Before ending off this video, I'd like to credit the source of information used for this video, which was the book called The History of Street Gangs in the United States: Their Origins and Transformations, the first edition by James Howell. And with all that being said, thank you so much for watching.